The sun blazed mercilessly over Naval Base as Lieutenant Sarah stepped out of the taxi, her crisp white uniform already beginning to wilt in the California heat. She paid the driver and grabbed her single duffel bag, taking a moment to survey what would be her new home for the next 2 years. The base stretched endlessly before her, a maze of identical gray buildings punctuated by gleaming aircraft and the distant sound of jets screaming overhead. Sarah had requested this transfer specifically. After years of desk duty in Washington, she craved something real, something that would challenge her in ways that paperwork and budget meetings never could. At 28, she was younger than most officers at her rank, a fact that had earned her both admiration and skepticism throughout her career. Her record was spotless, her recommendations glowing, but she knew that meant little when starting fresh somewhere new. The first person she encountered was Petty Officer Martinez at the main gate. He barely glanced at her ID before waving her through, his attention focused on a conversation with his colleague about weekend plans. Sarah didn't mind the casual treatment. She preferred to earn respect through actions rather than demand it through rank. Walking toward the administration building, she noticed clusters of personnel going about their daily routines. Some were loading equipment onto trucks, others were engaged in what appeared to be heated discussions about maintenance schedules. The base hummed with the kind of organized chaos she remembered from her academy days, before politics and bureaucracy had dominated her professional life. Her first official stop was the personnel office, where a harried-looking clerk named processed her paperwork with mechanical efficiency. He handed her a temporary ID badge, a map of the base, and a stack of forms that would need to be completed within her first week. "You'll be working under Commander Phillips in operations," explained without looking up from his computer screen. "He's expecting you at 1400 hours. Quarters are in Building C, second floor. Any questions?" Sarah glanced at her watch. She had 3 hours to get settled before her first official meeting. "Where's the best place to grab lunch?" "Cafeteria's in Building B, but the food's nothing special. There's a decent sandwich shop just outside the main gate if you don't mind the walk." Finally looked up, giving her a perfunctory smile. "Welcome to, Lieutenant." The quarters turned out to be a small but functional room with a narrow bed, a desk, and a closet barely large enough for her uniforms. Sarah had stayed in worse places during her various assignments, so she didn't complain. She unpacked quickly, hanging her dress blues carefully and arranging her few personal items on the desk. A framed photo of her parents at her academy graduation took pride of place next to her laptop. With time to spare, she decided to explore the base and get her bearings. The layout was fairly standard for a naval facility, with clear divisions between operational areas, living quarters, and administrative buildings. She made mental notes of important locations: the communications center, the flight line, the maintenance hangars, and the officers' club. It was near the flight line that she first encountered what would become a familiar group. 3 officers were standing in the shade of a hangar, their conversation animated and peppered with laughter. Sarah recognized the dynamic immediately. Every base had its unofficial social hierarchy, and these 3 clearly saw themselves near the top of it. The apparent leader was Lieutenant Commander Blake, a pilot whose swagger was visible even from a distance. His companions were Lieutenant Rick Torres, also a pilot, and Lieutenant from Communications. All 3 were in their early 30s, seasoned enough to be confident but young enough to still think they knew everything. Sarah walked past them on her way to examine one of the fighter jets parked nearby. She had always been fascinated by aircraft, even though her specialty was intelligence analysis. The sleek lines of the FA-18 Super Hornet were particularly impressive up close. "Well, what do we have here?" His voice carried easily across the tarmac. "Fresh meat, boys." Sarah continued her examination of the aircraft, noting the various weapons systems and electronic countermeasures. She had studied these planes extensively in training, but had never been this close to an operational model. "Hey, new girl," Torres called out. "You lost or something?" She turned slowly, her expression neutral. "Just getting familiar with the base layout. I start work this afternoon." Stepped forward with what he probably thought was a charming smile. "We haven't seen you around before. And these are my colleagues Blake and Rick Torres. We run things around here, especially for the newer personnel who need to learn the ropes." "I appreciate the welcome," Sarah replied politely. "I'm sure I'll figure things out quickly enough." Laughed, a sound that held more condescension than humor. "That's what they all think. This isn't some desk job in Washington, sweetheart. Out here, experience matters more than whatever they taught you in school. The assumption stung, partly because it was partially correct. Sarah had spent the last 3 years behind a desk, though not by choice. But she had also graduated first in her class from the Naval War College and had completed advanced training in intelligence analysis, strategic planning, and operational security. Her academic credentials were impressive, but she knew that wouldn't matter much here. "I'm sure you're right," she said simply. "Experience is valuable." Torres seemed encouraged by what he interpreted as deference. "Tell you what, new girl, why don't you join us for drinks tonight at the O Club? We can fill you in on how things really work around here. The official briefings only tell you so much." Sarah considered the invitation. On one hand, building relationships with fellow officers was important for both personal and professional reasons. On the other hand, something about these three rubbed her the wrong way. Their casual assumption of superiority, their dismissive attitude, and the way they had immediately labeled her as new girl rather than bothering to ask her name all suggested they might be more trouble than they were worth. "I'll have to see how my first day goes," she said diplomatically, "but thank you for the offer." His expression shifted slightly, as if he wasn't used to having his invitations treated as anything less than commands. "Sure, sure. But don't wait too long to make friends around here. This base can be a lonely place for people who don't fit in." The subtle threat in his words wasn't lost on Sarah, but she maintained her calm exterior. "I'll keep that in mind." As she walked away, she could hear the three men resuming their conversation, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch fragments about Washington desk jockeys and learning the hard way. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. If they only knew what was coming. Her meeting with Commander Phillips went smoothly. He was a professional officer in his late 40s who seemed genuinely pleased to have her on his team. He outlined her responsibilities, which would primarily involve intelligence analysis and strategic planning for base operations. The work was exactly what she had been hoping for, challenging and important without being overwhelming. "I've reviewed your file," Phillips said as they concluded their meeting. "Impressive academic record, excellent recommendations. I'm curious why you requested a transfer from such a cushy Pentagon assignment." "I wanted to get back to real operational work," Sarah answered honestly. "I felt like I was losing touch with the practical side of military service." Phillips nodded approvingly. "I can respect that. Too many officers get comfortable behind desks and forget what we're actually supposed to be doing. You'll find plenty of practical challenges here." That evening, Sarah decided to skip the officers' club and instead took a long run around the perimeter of the base. Physical fitness had always been her way of processing stress and new situations. The run also gave her another chance to observe the base operations and get a feel for the rhythm of military life here. As she ran, she thought about tours, and their type was common in the military, officers who confused seniority with superiority and used their positions to intimidate newer personnel. She had dealt with similar personalities throughout her career and had developed effective strategies for managing them. What they didn't know, and what she wasn't particularly eager to share, was that her transfer to this base wasn't just about getting back to operational work. It was also preparation for her next assignment, one that would fundamentally change the power dynamics they seemed so invested in maintaining. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Sarah threw herself into her work, quickly proving her competence and earning the respect of Commander Phillips and her other colleagues. The intelligence analysis was complex and rewarding, involving everything from threat assessment to strategic planning for potential operations in the Pacific Theater. However, her interactions with and his group became increasingly problematic. They seemed determined to establish their dominance over her, using a combination of condescension, exclusion, and subtle harassment that fell just short of anything she could formally complain about. During her second week, the situation escalated during a routine briefing about base security procedures. Was presenting information about flight operations when Sarah noticed several inconsistencies in his data. The protocols he was describing were outdated, having been superseded by new directives from Pacific Fleet Command just 3 months earlier. Sarah faced a dilemma. She could remain silent and let the incorrect information stand, or she could speak up and risk further antagonizing. Her commitment to accuracy won out. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Commander," she said during the question period. "I think there might be some outdated information in your presentation. The protocols you mentioned were revised in the spring directive from Pac Fleet. The room fell silent. His face reddened as he glanced down at his notes. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Lieutenant. These procedures have been standard for over a year. Sarah opened her tablet and quickly pulled up the relevant directive. According to Pac Fleet Directive 2020-415, dated March 15th, the standby procedures for Alert 5 status were modified to include additional communication protocols and shortened response times. Commander Phillips leaned forward with interest. Can you send me a copy of that directive? I want to make sure we're all working from the same playbook. Of course, sir. Sarah quickly forwarded the document to Phillips, and for the sake of courtesy, to as well. His jaw tightened as he reviewed the directive on his own device. The new protocols were clearly outlined and completely contradicted what he had just presented to the room. Well, he said after a long pause, it looks like someone forgot to update their files. The meeting concluded awkwardly, with Phillips making notes about implementing the correct procedures immediately. As the room emptied, Sarah found herself face to face with Tors and... Congratulations, said in a low voice. You just made your first real enemy on this base. Tors stepped closer, his voice equally quiet but unmistakably threatening. You might want to be more careful about showing off, new girl. Accidents happen to people who don't know their place. His contribution was a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. This base can be dangerous for people who don't have friends watching their backs. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, her expression calm but her mind racing. She had hoped to avoid this kind of confrontation, but it seemed inevitable given their personalities and her unwillingness to be intimidated. I appreciate your concern for my safety, she said evenly. I'll be sure to stay alert. The three men exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared understanding that Sarah was now officially a problem that needed to be dealt with. What none of them realized was that in trying to intimidate her, they had just made the biggest mistake of their military careers. The following weeks would test everyone involved in ways they couldn't yet imagine, and the ultimate resolution would reshape the entire dynamic of Naval Base in ways that no one could have predicted. The campaign against Sarah began subtly, as these things usually do. It started with small inconveniences that could easily be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. Her access card to the Secure Communications Center mysteriously stopped working twice in 1 week. Important emails somehow ended up in her spam folder. Her assigned parking space was repeatedly occupied by other vehicles, forcing her to park in remote areas of the base. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen similar tactics used against other officers who had fallen out of favor with established power groups. The beauty of this approach was its deniability. Each individual incident could be explained away as a technical glitch, an honest mistake, or simple bad timing. But the cumulative effect was designed to create stress, frustration, and social isolation. Commander Phillips noticed some of the issues and tried to help resolve them, but the problems always seemed to resurface after a brief respite. During one particularly frustrating week, when Sarah's computer access was mysteriously revoked 3 separate times, Phillips pulled her aside for a private conversation. I have to ask, he said, closing his office door behind them. Are you having problems with anyone on base? Some of these technical issues you've been experiencing seem unusual. Sarah appreciated his concern, but she also knew that complaints about workplace harassment were career killers unless you had ironclad proof and significant institutional support. She had neither. Nothing I can't handle, sir. Just some growing pains settling into a new assignment. Phillips studied her face carefully. You know, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I've learned to recognize when good officers are being deliberately sabotaged. If someone is giving you trouble, I want to know about it. I appreciate that, sir. If it becomes a real problem, I'll definitely bring it to your attention. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, but internally she was grateful to have at least one ally in leadership. The harassment escalated during the base's quarterly readiness exercise. The 3-day drill was designed to test every aspect of base operations under simulated emergency conditions. Sarah had been assigned to coordinate intelligence support for the exercise, a critical role that required her to work closely with multiple departments across the base. On the morning of the first day, she arrived at the command center to find that her workstation had been reassigned to another officer. According to the duty roster that had mysteriously been updated overnight, she was now assigned to equipment inventory in Warehouse 7, a meaningless make-work task that would effectively remove her from any important role in the exercise. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant," said the duty officer, a young ensign who looked genuinely apologetic. "The change came down from Lieutenant Commander's office, something about needing your expertise for supply chain analysis." Sarah knew this was retaliation for her earlier correction of briefing, but proving it would be nearly impossible. She swallowed her frustration and reported to the warehouse, where she spent 8 hours counting aircraft parts and updating inventory spreadsheets that probably hadn't been touched in months. During lunch break, she overheard tours and discussing the exercise in the cafeteria. They were sitting several tables away, but their voices carried clearly across the mostly empty dining area. "Did you see Face this morning?" Tors was saying with obvious amusement. "I thought she was going to cry when she realized she'd been stuck in the warehouse." Laughed really knows how to put people in their place. Maybe now she'll think twice before trying to show off in briefings. "The best part is, there's nothing she can do about it," Tors continued. "Any complaint she makes just looks like sour grapes from someone who couldn't handle a routine assignment change." Sarah continued eating her sandwich, her expression carefully neutral. She was learning valuable lessons about the base's informal power structure and the methods these three used to maintain their influence. The information would be useful later. The second day of the exercise brought new challenges. Sarah arrived at the warehouse to find that half of the inventory she had carefully the previous day had been mysteriously disrupted. Equipment had been moved, labels had been removed, and several expensive electronic components were missing entirely. When she reported the discrepancies to the exercise controllers, she was told that this was probably part of the drill's designed chaos and that she should simply document everything and continue with her assigned tasks. The implication was clear. Her concerns weren't important enough to investigate during such a critical exercise. But Sarah had been trained in intelligence analysis, which meant she was skilled at recognizing patterns and identifying important details that others might miss. As she worked through the warehouse chaos, she noticed something that the perpetrators had probably not intended for her to see. One of the missing electronic components was a specialized navigation system worth over $50,000. According to the inventory records, it had been present and accounted for just yesterday. Its disappearance during the exercise suggested either serious security problems or deliberate sabotage. More importantly, the serial number and storage location had been recorded in multiple databases, making it difficult to simply write off as exercise-related confusion. Sarah quietly photographed the relevant inventory sheets and began cross-referencing the missing equipment with base security protocols. What she found was troubling. The navigation system required special handling authorization, and only 3 people on base had the clearance to move it without generating automatic alerts: Commander Phillips, the base security chief, and Lieutenant Commander. The discovery presented Sarah with a serious dilemma. If the equipment had been stolen or misplaced due to negligence, it represented a significant security breach that needed to be reported immediately. But if was involved in its disappearance as part of the campaign against her, any report she made would look like retaliation for her recent treatment. She decided to continue her investigation quietly. Using her intelligence training and access to various base databases, she began mapping the movement of personnel and equipment during the previous 24 hours. The picture that emerged was troubling but not yet conclusive. Had been in the warehouse area twice during the previous day, both times during shift changes when fewer people were around to observe his activities. Tors had also been nearby during one of those periods, officially conducting communications checks, but actually spending considerable time near the storage areas containing the most valuable equipment. More concerning was the discovery that this wasn't the first time equipment had gone missing during exercises. Sarah found records of 3 previous incidents over the past year, each involving expensive electronic components that were eventually written off as exercise losses or administrative errors. The pattern suggested either systematic theft or an elaborate scheme designed to create problems for people who had fallen out of favor with the group. Either possibility was serious enough to warrant investigation, but Sarah needed more evidence before making any formal reports. On the final day of the exercise, the situation took a more personal turn. Sarah arrived at the warehouse to find her personal vehicle blocked in by two trucks parked at odd angles. The positioning was clearly deliberate, leaving her car completely inaccessible even to pedestrians. When she asked around about who might have parked the trucks, she was told that they had been moved there as part of a logistics exercise by personnel from Flight Operations Group. The trucks would supposedly remain in position until the end of the day, effectively stranding her on base until after normal working hours. Sarah used the opportunity to continue her investigation of the missing equipment. Without the distraction of routine inventory tasks, she was able to access more detailed database records and cross-reference them with security footage from the warehouse area. What she found was definitive proof of equipment theft. The security cameras had captured entering the warehouse after hours on the night before the missing navigation system was discovered. The footage showed him using his access codes to enter the high-security storage area and removing a container that matched the size and shape of the missing equipment. More footage from the following day showed tours and serving as lookouts during what appeared to be the transfer of stolen equipment to an unmarked civilian vehicle in the base parking area. The entire operation had been planned and executed with military precision, suggesting they had done this before. Sarah now faced a decision that would define not only her career, but potentially the careers of 3 other officers. The evidence she had gathered was solid enough to trigger a formal investigation, but pursuing it would almost certainly destroy any chance of maintaining cordial relationships with established base personnel. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that group represented a larger problem than simple harassment. They were using their positions to steal military equipment, possibly for personal profit or potentially for more sinister purposes. The national security implications were significant. That evening, after the exercise officially concluded, and she was finally able to retrieve her vehicle, Sarah made 2 phone calls. The first was to a secure number at Naval Criminal Investigative Service headquarters. The second was to her former supervisor at the Pentagon, a woman who had served as both mentor and friend throughout Sarah's career. The NCIS conversation was brief and professional. She provided the relevant serial numbers and case details, uploaded her photographic evidence to their secure server, and agreed to cooperate fully with any investigation that might follow. The agent she spoke with seemed genuinely interested in the case and promised to follow up within 48 hours. The call to her Pentagon mentor was more personal. Captain Maria had been instrumental in Sarah's career development and had specifically recommended her for the assignment. "Sarah, how are you settling in out there?" asked warmly. "I heard through the grapevine that you're making quite an impression." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you," Sarah replied carefully. She outlined the harassment campaign and the equipment theft without mentioning specific names or details that might compromise the ongoing investigation. Listened thoughtfully before responding. "You know, it's interesting that you bring this up. I've been hearing some concerning reports about leadership issues at, nothing specific enough to act on, but a pattern of complaints about favoritism and resource management problems. I think the issues might be more serious than anyone realized," Sarah said. "I've reported what I found to the appropriate authorities, but I wanted you to know that things might get complicated here over the next few weeks. I appreciate the heads up. And Sarah, be careful. If you've stumbled onto something significant, there could be pushback from people with more influence than you might expect." That warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them anticipated. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work to find a message requesting her immediate presence in Commander Phillips' office. When she entered, she found Phillips looking grim and sitting across from his desk with an expression of barely controlled anger. "Lieutenant," Phillips began formally, "Lieutenant Commander has brought some serious concerns to my attention regarding your conduct during the readiness exercise." Leaned forward slightly. "Sir, I hate to make this kind of report about a fellow officer, but Lieutenant's behavior during the exercise was completely inappropriate. She abandoned her assigned post, interfered with ongoing operations, and accessed classified materials without proper authorization." Sarah felt her stomach drop, but she maintained her composure. "Sir, I remained at my assigned post throughout the exercise and followed all established protocols for accessing inventory records." "That's not what my personnel observed," replied smoothly. "Multiple witnesses saw you in unauthorized areas of the base, taking photographs of sensitive materials and conducting what appeared to be surveillance activities on base personnel. Phillips looked troubled. These are serious allegations. Lieutenant Commander is suggesting that your behavior might constitute a security breach or even potential espionage activities. The audacity of the accusations took Sarah's breath away. Was not only trying to destroy her career, but was also attempting to criminalize her investigation into his own illegal activities. It was a bold move that demonstrated both his confidence in his position and his desperation to stop her investigation. "Sir, I request permission to provide a full written response to these allegations," Sarah said formally. "I believe there may be some serious misunderstandings about my activities during the exercise." His eyes narrowed. "I think what Lieutenant needs to understand is that making false accusations against senior officers is itself a serious offense. Perhaps she should consider whether pursuing this matter further is really in her best interests." The threat was clear enough that even Phillips seemed uncomfortable with its directness. "That's enough. Lieutenant has the right to respond to any allegations made against her conduct." "Of course, sir," replied, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I just want to make sure that Lieutenant understands the potential consequences of continuing down this path. Sometimes it's better for everyone involved to simply acknowledge mistakes and move forward professionally." Sarah realized that had no idea she had already contacted NCIS. He was operating under the assumption that he could intimidate her into dropping her investigation before it gained any official momentum. His confidence suggested he had used similar tactics successfully in the past. "I appreciate Lieutenant Commander's concerns," she said carefully. "I look forward to providing a complete account of my activities during the exercise for official review." Phillips nodded. "Very well. I want a detailed written report on my desk by close of business tomorrow. I want the same from you, including any supporting witness statements. We'll get to the bottom of this matter quickly and professionally." As they left Phillips' office, caught Sarah's arm in what might have appeared to be a friendly gesture to any observers. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he whispered. "Last chance to be smart about this." Sarah looked directly into his eyes and smiled slightly. "I think I have a pretty good idea of what I'm getting into. The question is whether you do." The confusion that flashed across his face was deeply satisfying. For the first time since arriving at, Sarah felt like she might actually have the upper hand in this conflict. What didn't know was that his window of opportunity to control the situation had already closed. The NCIS investigation was already, and within hours, everything he thought he knew about Lieutenant Sarah was about to change dramatically. The NCIS agents arrived at Naval Base at exactly 800 hours on Thursday morning, 3 days after Sarah's report, and 1 day before its deadline for her written response. They came in 2 unmarked vehicles and went directly to the base commander's office without fanfare or announcement. Most personnel didn't even notice their arrival, but Sarah had been expecting them. Special Agent Jennifer and Special Agent were seasoned investigators who specialized in military equipment theft and corruption cases. They had reviewed Sarah's evidence package during their drive from San and were impressed by both the quality of her investigation and the seriousness of the allegations. Base Commander Captain Robert Sterling was a career naval officer who prided himself on running a tight, professional operation. The suggestion that senior personnel under his command were involved in systematic theft was both shocking and deeply embarrassing. His first instinct was to defend his people, but the evidence presented by the NCIS agents was too compelling to dismiss. "How long has this been going on?" Sterling asked after reviewing the security footage and inventory discrepancies. Agent consulted her notes. "Based on the pattern analysis Lieutenant provided, we estimate at least 18 months, possibly longer. The total value of missing equipment could exceed $500,000. "And you're certain that Lieutenant Commander is involved?" "The security footage places him at the scene during the time the navigation system went missing," Agent replied. "We also have financial records showing unusual deposits into accounts controlled by and his associates that correspond with the timing of previous equipment disappearances." Sterling rubbed his temples. "What do you need from me?" "We need to conduct interviews with tours and without alerting them to the investigation. We also need to secure all relevant equipment and records before they can be tampered with or destroyed." "Done. How do you want to handle this?" The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Tours, and would be called to separate meetings under the pretense of routine security briefings. Meanwhile, NCIS agents would secure the relevant evidence and interview other personnel who might have knowledge of the theft operation. Sarah was asked to continue her normal duties while remaining available for additional questions. She was specifically instructed not to discuss the investigation with anyone, including Commander Phillips. The need for complete secrecy was essential to prevent evidence destruction or witness intimidation. At 10:30 hours, received a call requesting his presence in the base commander's conference room for what was described as a briefing on new security protocols. He arrived confident and relaxed, expecting another routine administrative meeting. Instead, he found himself face to face with Captain Sterling, agent, and agent. The conference room door was closed, and a uniformed security officer was stationed outside. "Lieutenant Commander," Sterling began formally, "these agents are from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They have some questions regarding base security procedures and equipment accountability." His confident expression faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, sir. Happy to help with any security review." Agent placed a tablet on the conference table and turned it toward. "Can you identify the person in this security footage?" The video showed entering the high-security storage area on the night before the navigation system was discovered missing. The timestamp was clearly visible, and his face was unmistakably recognizable despite the poor lighting conditions. Studied the footage for several seconds before responding. "That appears to be me, yes. I was conducting a routine security inspection of the storage areas. It's part of my regular duties as operations officer." "At 22:30 hours on a Tuesday night?" Agent asked. "That seems unusual for routine inspections." "I often work irregular hours," replied smoothly. "The nature of military operations requires flexibility in scheduling." Agent tapped the tablet screen, advancing the video to show removing a container from the storage racks. "Can you explain what you were removing during this routine inspection?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I may have been relocating some equipment for maintenance scheduling. Without reviewing my duty logs, I can't recall the specific details." "The container you removed contained a specialized navigation system worth $53,000, Agent said. "That system was reported missing the following day. Where is it now?" "I would need to review the maintenance records to determine its current location," answered carefully. "Equipment is frequently moved for various operational reasons." The interview continued for nearly 2 hours, with maintaining his story about routine inspections and maintenance procedures. However, the agents had additional evidence that gradually undermined his explanations. Financial records showed large cash deposits into his personal accounts that corresponded with the disappearance of valuable equipment. Witnesses had observed him and his associates meeting with unidentified civilians in base parking areas during off-duty hours. Most damaging was the discovery that had been using his access codes to enter secure areas during times when he had no official duties requiring such access. The pattern of unauthorized entries corresponded perfectly with the timeline of missing equipment reports. By noon, Tors and had been interviewed separately, and their stories contradicted account in several key areas. Tors claimed no knowledge of late-night security inspections, while insisted that all communications equipment under his supervision had remained properly secured throughout the relevant time periods. Meanwhile, a search of on-base quarters revealed additional stolen equipment, including 2 radio systems and a laptop computer that had been reported missing during previous exercises. The discovery provided definitive proof that the theft operation was more extensive than initially suspected. Captain Sterling was furious when he learned the full scope of the criminal activity that had been occurring under his command. He immediately ordered Tors and to be relieved of their duties pending the outcome of the investigation. Military police were assigned to escort them from their duty stations and restrict their access to base facilities. The news of their suspension spread quickly through the base, creating shock waves among personnel who had viewed and his associates as untouchable fixtures of the command structure. Many officers who had been intimidated or marginalized by the trio began coming forward with their own stories of harassment, favoritism, and suspicious activities. Sarah learned about the arrests when Commander Phillips called her into his office that afternoon. His expression was a mixture of admiration and embarrassment. "I owe you an apology," he began. "I should have recognized what was happening and taken action sooner. Your courage in reporting this situation probably prevented much more serious security breaches." "Thank you, sir. I just did what any officer should do when they discover potential criminal activity." Phillips studied her thoughtfully. "Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Most officers would have either ignored the situation or reported it through channels that could have controlled or suppressed. Your decision to contact NCIS directly showed remarkable judgment and integrity." "I had good training in recognizing security threats, sir." "Yes, about that training," Phillips said with a slight smile. "I've been reviewing your complete service record, and there are some interesting details that weren't included in your initial personnel file." Sarah felt a familiar tension in her stomach. This was the conversation she had been both anticipating and dreading since her arrival at. Phillips opened a classified folder on his desk. "According to this file, your transfer to wasn't just about getting back to operational work. You're here as part of a specific preparation assignment." "Yes, sir. An assignment that involves taking command of this base in approximately 6 months." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah had known this moment would come eventually, but the timing was still startling. "Yes, sir. I'm scheduled to assume command as Base Admiral in June, following my promotion to Rear Admiral." Phillips leaned back in his chair, processing this information. So Wen and his friends were harassing and threatening the new girl. They were actually targeting their incoming commanding officer. "That appears to be the case, sir." "My God," Phillips breathed. "They have no idea what they've done." The full scope of his mistake was indeed staggering. In addition to theft, fraud, and conspiracy charges, he and his associates were now facing potential charges of threatening a senior officer, insubordination, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The harassment campaign that had been designed to establish their dominance had instead created a detailed record of their criminal misconduct. Word of Sarah's true identity and future role spread through the base even faster than news of the arrests. Officers who had witnessed treatment of her were by their failure to intervene. Personnel who had been intimidated by this group suddenly found their voices and began sharing stories of harassment and abuse that had previously been suppressed. Captain Sterling requested a private meeting with Sarah the following day. He was clearly embarrassed by the situation and concerned about the impact on base morale and operations. "Admiral Select," he began, using her future rank in acknowledgement of the changed circumstances. "I want to personally apologize for allowing this situation to develop under my command. The harassment you experienced was completely unacceptable, and I should have recognized and addressed it immediately." "Captain Sterling, I don't hold you responsible for the actions of subordinate officers who were deliberately concealing their criminal activities," Sarah replied diplomatically. "This situation provided valuable insights into base operations that will be useful when I assume command. Nevertheless, I failed in my duty to maintain proper discipline and protect all personnel under my command. I will be recommending myself for appropriate administrative action." Sarah appreciated his integrity, but she also recognized that Sterling was a competent commander who had been deceived by skilled manipulators. "Sir, if I may suggest, this situation demonstrates the importance of robust oversight and multiple reporting channels for security concerns. Perhaps we could focus on implementing systemic improvements rather than individual punishment." Sterling looked relieved. "That's very generous of you. What kind of improvements did you have in mind?" Over the next hour, Sarah outlined her observations about base operations and her recommendations for addressing the institutional weaknesses that had allowed this operation to flourish. Her suggestions included enhanced security protocols, improved personnel evaluation procedures, and the establishment of alternative reporting channels for harassment and misconduct complaints. "These are excellent recommendations," Sterling said when she finished. "Would you be willing to begin implementing some of these changes before your official assumption of command? I think it would be beneficial for both the base and your transition." "I'd be happy to help in any way that's appropriate, sir." The trial of Tours and became a significant event within naval legal circles. The case demonstrated how personal harassment could mask serious criminal activity and highlighted the importance of protecting personnel who report misconduct. All three men were convicted on multiple charges and received substantial prison sentences along with dishonorable discharges from the Navy. During the sentencing hearing, Saturni attempted to argue that his client's actions were the result of stress and poor judgment rather than criminal intent. The argument fell flat when prosecutors presented evidence of the systematic nature of the theft operation and the deliberate harassment campaign against Sarah. The defendants didn't just steal military equipment, the prosecutor argued. They created a climate of intimidation that prevented other personnel from reporting their crimes. They abused their positions of authority to silence potential witnesses and victims. This represents a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in military officers. The judge agreed, noting that the defendants' abuse of rank and authority made their crimes particularly serious. Military justice depends on the integrity and honor of those who hold positions of responsibility, he said during sentencing. When officers use their authority to commit crimes and silence those who might expose them, they undermine the very foundation of military discipline and effectiveness. Sarah attended the sentencing hearing as both a victim and a witness. Seeing Tors and in handcuffs was deeply satisfying, but she took no pleasure in the destruction of their careers and lives. Their actions had forced this outcome, but she understood that their families would suffer consequences they didn't deserve. After the trial concluded, Sarah threw herself into preparing for her new command responsibilities. The 6 months between the arrests and her promotion passed quickly, filled with intensive briefings, strategic planning sessions, and relationship building with key personnel and civilian leaders. When the day finally arrived for her change of command ceremony, Sarah stood before an assembly that included many of the same people who had witnessed harassment campaign. The contrast was striking. Where had demanded respect through intimidation and abuse, Sarah had earned it through competence, integrity, and courage. Captain Sterling, who had been selected for promotion and transfer to a prestigious Pentagon assignment, presided over the ceremony. In his remarks, he acknowledged the difficult period the base had endured and praised Sarah's role in exposing and addressing the systemic problems that had developed. Admiral brings not only exceptional qualifications and experience to this command, Sterling said, but also the moral courage and integrity that are essential for effective leadership. Her actions as a lieutenant demonstrated the kind of character we need in our senior officers. As Sarah accepted command of Naval Base, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The harassment and intimidation she had endured had been difficult and stressful, but it had also provided valuable insights into the base's culture and operations. More importantly, it had demonstrated that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult and dangerous, ultimately led to positive outcomes. In her first address as commanding admiral, Sarah spoke directly about the importance of creating an environment where all personnel could serve with dignity and respect. She outlined her vision for a base culture based on mutual respect, professional excellence, and zero tolerance for harassment or misconduct. Every person who serves at this base has value and deserves to be treated with respect, she said. Our mission effectiveness depends not just on our equipment and training, but on our ability to work together as a team united by shared values and common purpose. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Many of the personnel present had experienced or witnessed the toxic environment that and his associates had created. They understood that Sarah's leadership represented a fundamental change in how the base would operate. After the ceremony, as Sarah settled into her new office, she found a handwritten note that had been left on her desk by one of the junior enlisted personnel. The note was brief but moving. "Thank you for showing us that standing up for what's right is always worth it, even when it's scary." Sarah smiled as she read the note. The young sailor who had written it understood something that Tors and had never grasped. True leadership wasn't about intimidation or hierarchy. It was about creating an environment where everyone could contribute their best efforts toward shared goals. Looking out her office window at the base she now commanded, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. The harassment campaign that was supposed to break her spirit had instead revealed her character and prepared her for the challenges ahead. And his associates had thought they were targeting a vulnerable newcomer, but they had actually chosen to battle against the very principles and values that made military service meaningful. Their defeat was complete not because they had been punished, but because their vision of leadership through fear and intimidation had been replaced by something better. The base they had once dominated through bullying and corruption was now led by someone committed to excellence, integrity, and respect for all personnel. In the end, Tours and had achieved the exact opposite of their intentions. Instead of establishing their dominance over a perceived threat, they had accelerated the rise of a leader who would transform the base in ways they never could have imagined. Their legacy would be remembered not as a cautionary tale about challenging authority, but as proof that courage and integrity ultimately triumph over corruption and abuse. The new girl they had tried to intimidate was now the admiral they would never be, and the base they thought they controlled was now a place where such behavior would never again be tolerated. It was, perhaps, the most fitting justice imaginable.